One of the pleasures of the reading life is being able to share a favorite author or book with other people. A few years ago, I was asked to do just that for the annual lunch of the Friends of the Library. And for many of you, it might be of special interest at this time of year. My subject once framed an existential aspect of the human condition in the following way. Can you imagine, he said, can you imagine 4,000 years passing and you're not even a memory? That's about it, friends. It's not just a possibility, it's a certainty. And I think I'll use a similar construction to introduce him to you. Imagine you've had a full and productive career as an author, as a raconteur and storyteller on radio and television, that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, awaited eagerly what you had to say every night. That you commanded a following so loyal that at your behest, before you ever write your first book, they help you single-handedly upend the New York Times list of best-selling books. That you inspired lead characters in at least 2 iconic movies that to this day remain admired for their insights into the human condition, into the distortion of culture and the individual by mass entertainment and mass media. That you inspired a popular song universally recognized and enjoyed. Imagine that what I've just described barely scratches the surface of your enduring influence on American culture. Now imagine, after all of it, that you're remembered chiefly for what many regard, as enjoyable as it is, as the very least of all your works. Imagine that, and you have the framework for understanding the career and influence of author and humorist Jean Shepard. And that work by which he's mostly remembered, every one of you knows it. The movie A Christmas Story, about the young boy who wants a Red Ryder BB gun for Christmas. Written and narrated by Shepard and based on several of his short stories, they appear in his first book, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, published in 1966. I'm sure there are many of you who grew up within striking distance of New York City and heard Shepard on the radio. For me and for many, probably most, of those who became acquainted with Shepard's work, it was first through his radio shows. For 22 years, from 1955 to 1977, Shep broadcast every weeknight and for many years on Saturdays over radio station WOR in New York City. And if you never heard him on the air, you missed something absolutely unique. In the early years, all night long, from the early 60s for 45 minutes every night, Shep held forth each night in a remarkably lucid and fluent extemporaneous monologue. There's no way to capture lightning in a bottle, and so there's no way that I or anyone else can do justice to Shepard on the air, to the breadth of what he did or what he was all about. I'll turn to his writing to illustrate his use of language and some of the narrative and rhetorical devices by which he conveyed a unique comic sensibility, sometimes with a dark or cynical edge, always managing to conjoin the commonplace with the profound, the hilarious with a sense of inevitable futility. Remember in the Christmas Story movie? What does every adult tell little Ralph when he asks for the BB gun? You'll shoot your eye out, kid. What happens the very first time he pulls the trigger? He comes this close to shooting his eye out. The ricocheting BB raises a big bloody welt right along his temple as it just misses the eye. There is no escape. A frequent moral of Jean Shepard's fables. But to impart at least some idea of Shepard's art and influence, I have to discuss as best I can what he did on the radio. First was the voice. Warm, charismatic, folksy, described as half-wise uncle and half-wise acre, cozying, abounding with jest, above all talking straight to you, the listener. For me, as a boy and young man listening to Shepard, as someone described it, it was just as if some version of myself, with 25 more years of life experience, had crawled into the radio, sat down and loosened his tie, and off he went. He'd often start off with a few oddball stories culled from the day's news. Not the doings of the great or the fate of nations, but things he described as straws in the wind. Items he said laid bare the reality of the human condition, or showed, in their way, where we're all headed. Things that disclose more about ourselves than we might realize. For Shepard, these quirky events comprise the substance of the life most of us live most of the time. But we don't pay attention to them in part because they define the difference between our dreams and reality. the long-anticipated dream date that ended in disaster, the guy who bought a harpsichord kit that ended up half-built in the back of the closet for years and finally was tossed out. Often involving people who had become absolutely fed up in one way or another. The woman, so incensed when the Lexington Avenue bus didn't stop at her corner that she whipped off a shoe and whacked the driver. The dissatisfied customer who took revenge, returning with a sledgehammer to the shop where he bought his defective TV and smashing every television in sight. And there we have it, Shepard would say, the news of people as they are. And because he made it clear that he was just as bewildered and amused as you were, that he noticed what you noticed, to his listeners he became a voice you could trust. From these straws in the wind, Shep would subtly weave his way into his story of the night, always demonstrating the larger point, frequently involving life's built-in futility, or the pains of growing up, or the immutability of human nature, or man's existential insignificance in the context of the universe or of time. Spinning off into tangents, it's been said like some masterful juggler with a dozen balls in the air at once, and as the show drew to an end, Shep tied it all together to make his point about life, or being a kid, or the future of the human race, or how technology changes us. Often he recounted stories of his childhood growing up during the Depression in northern Indiana, in the shadow of the steel mills along Lake Michigan. These recollections comprised his first book, on which A Christmas Story was based. And so if you're familiar with the movie, you have some idea of his basic comic tone. But to me, as someone familiar with his books and on-air work, the film doesn't quite convey Shepard's edge. It catches the bittersweet nostalgia, but only hints at that sense of futility that runs like a subtle undercurrent through much of his work, of our own limitations, of childhood's moments of solitude, of the difference between the life we live and the way we think we live it, or want to. Shep described the antecedents of much of his humor, and these are his words, as the humor of the school of futility, futility and the usual triumph of evil over good, which is another name for realism. Many Shepard stories involved his experiences in the Army, or his career in radio and television, or talking about contemporary events in the passing scene. It was in the latter that I think he was at his most remarkable, talking about trends of the moment, but always with an eye to the future. In listening to him today, 50 years on, you recognize a remarkable prescience that prevents his material from seeming dated. Principally, I think, because the constant in his universe of observation and description is shaped by the basic tenets of human nature itself, something that doesn't change. And all this done in a context of hilarity. I don't want to paint a portrait of that edge Shepard brought to his work as negative. Brutally realistic, yes, but never overlooking the more positive aspects of the human condition or our capacity for love and learning. And that brutal realism, I think, is the source of Gene Shepard's humor. Quentin Crisp, another author and raconteur whose writing I admire, observed that if you describe things as better than they are, people will call you an optimist. Describe them as worse than they are, they'll call you a pessimist. But if you describe things exactly as they are, people will call you a satirist. And this was Shepard's strength and the heart of his comic style, describing the steel mill town of his youth, his blue-collar or just barely white-collar family, his father, always referred to as the old man, who approached all aspects of life important to him with a kind of manic intensity, his running battle with the coal furnace, his succession of used cars held together with chewing gum and baling wire, the Chicago White Sox. His mother, in Shepard's stories, eternally hunched over the kitchen sink in her rump-sprung Chinese red chenille bathrobe with flecks of petrified egg on the lapel. His little brother, not much more in the stories than a constantly running nose, forever whimpering beneath the daybed. His boyhood friends, Schwartz, Flick, Bruner, and Kissel, who figure in story after story in the books and on the radio. Shepard writes in a distinctly American idiom, abounding in rich comic nouns and verbs, embellished with vivid adjectives and adverbs, weaving together hyperbole and metaphor to create the overall effect. And so he describes his hometown. Homan, Indiana is located where the state line ends abruptly in the icy, detergent-filled waters of Lake Michigan. It clings precariously to the underbody of Chicago like a barnacle clings to the rotting hulk of a tramp steamer. Echoes of the outside world arrive in Homan, but they're muted and bear little relevance to the daily life of its inhabitants. Theirs is a world of belching furnaces, roaring Bessemer converters, fragrant petroleum distillation plants, and freight yards. Mostly their social life is found in bowling halls, or union halls, or beer halls, not to mention dance halls and pool parlors. A sandy, rolling country frozen to rigidity in winter by howling gales that got their start near the Arctic Circle, picked up force over the frozen waste of Lake Michigan, and petered out in downtown Homan after freezing years, cracking engine blocks, and stunting the summer hopes in many a breast. In Shepard's world, it's never just cold. It's like this. Early December saw the first of the great blizzards. The wind howling out of the Canadian wilds a few hundred miles to the north had screamed over frozen Lake Michigan and hit Homan, laying on the town great drifts of snow and long, story-high icicles and sub-zero temperatures where the air cracked and sang. Streetcar wires creaked under caked ice, and kids plodded to school through 45-mile-an-hour gales, tilting forward like tiny furred radiator ornaments, moving stiffly over the barren, clattering ground. There was no question of staying home. It never entered into anyone's mind. My mother would simply throw her shoulder against the front door, pushing back the advancing drifts and stone ice, the wind raking the living room rug with angry fury for an instant, and we'd be launched, one after another, my brother and I, like astronauts into unfriendly Arctic space. The door clanged shut, and that was it. Scattered out over the icy waste around us could be seen other tiny, befurred jots of wind-driven humanity, all painfully toiling toward the Warren G. Harding School, miles away over the tundra, waddling under the weight of frost-covered clothing like tiny, frozen bowling balls with feet. Never merely cold, and in the world of Shepard's boyhood, never merely hot. And the heat. My God, the heat. It was 900, maybe 1,200 degrees. I have to describe to you what summer in northern Indiana is like. It descends like a 500-pound fat man onto a picnic bench in the middle of July. It can be sliced into chunks and stored away in the basement to use in winter. On cold days, you just bring it out and turn it on. Indiana heat is not a meteorological phenomenon. It's a solid element, something you grab by the handles. Almost every day in summer, the whole town is just shimmering in front of you. You look across the street, and skinny people will be all fat and wiggly, like in the funhouse mirrors at Coney Island. The asphalt in the streets would bubble and hiss like a pot of steaming Ralston. Shepard's use of metaphor and analogy, especially his frequent trick of juxtaposing the momentous and the trivial, that's something he frequently does to great effect. Recalling a department store's Christmas display as a golden, tinkling panoply of mechanized electronic joy. He describes all 7 of the dwarves going about their work with a dancing Snow White, a mechanized Santa ho-ho-hoing as Mrs. Claus perpetually irons Santa's red shirt, and Raggedy Andy sitting atop a castle moat with a Lionel electric train going around it. All in all, Shepard concludes, Santa's workshop made Salvador Dali look like Norman Rockwell. A typical example of Shepard's descriptive powers and use of analogy comes in his recollection of the radio announcers of his childhood. And from that, he segues into one of his typical observations of life, as he so often does from a kid's perspective. On would come a guy named Pierre Andre, the definitive radio announcer. His voice boomed out of the Crosley radio like some maniacal monster pipe organ played by the devil himself. Vibrant, urgent, dynamic, commanding. I've long had a suspicion that an entire generation of Americans grew up feeling inferior to just the names of the guys on the radio. Pierre Andre, Harlow Wilcox, Vincent Pelletier, Truman Bradley, Westbrook Van Voorhees, Andre Baruch, Norman Brokenshire. There wasn't a Charlie Schmidlap in the lot. Poor little Charlie, crouching next to his radio, a born right fielder, playing right field all his life, knee-deep in weeds, waiting for a fly ball that never comes, and more than half afraid that one day it will. Pierre-Andre could get more out of just numbers than Orson Welles could squeeze out of King Lear. And before I move beyond some of the author's recollections of his youth, here's something as typical of Gene Shepard as any of his work I've read, recounting his favorite entertainment as a kid. You may remember this from the Christmas Story movie. At exactly 5:15, just as dusk was gathering over the picturesque oil refineries and the faint glow of the muttering open hearths was beginning to show red against the gloom, the magic notes of an unforgettable theme song came rasping out of our Crosley. Who's the little chatterbox? The one with curly golden locks. Who do I see? It's little orphan Annie. They don't write tunes like that anymore. There was one particularly brilliant line that dealt with Sandy, little orphan Andy's Airedale sidekick. Who can forget it? Arf, goes Sandy. Dogs in our neighborhood never went arf, and they certainly were a lot of things, but never faithful. Little orphan Andy lived in this great place called Tompkins Corners. They never mentioned the pool room. There were no stockyards or fistfights or drunk sleeping in doorways in good old Tompkins Corners. She also had this friend named the Asp, who, whenever she was really in a tight spot, would just show up and cut everybody's head off. I figured that if there was one thing a kid of 7 needed, it was somebody named the Asp, especially in our neighborhood. In some very small measure, these snippets of Shepard's written work convey, I hope, some sense of his comic style. But for all his nostalgic storytelling, Shepard was no rustic provincial, very much a man of the cutting-edge culture of his time. Temperamentally and intuitively, he was an urban sophisticate who considered himself a real New Yorker, a champion of the poet of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, an early writer for the Village Voice. Harper's Magazine once called him radio's noble savage, because through it all, and however nostalgic or homespun the story that got him there, Shepard delivered the kind of trenchant and cynical observations of the culture with a pitch-perfect precision that resonated with an urban audience. Much more of a wild man on the radio than in his written work, Shepard might come on the air playing the kazoo or singing along to some crazy old tune from the Depression era. He once did an entire show on the lyrics to the song Hindustan, which topped the charts back around 1933. You'd never expect that to be one of the most hilarious shows he ever did, but it is, and you can hear it today. Hundreds of his original programs, faithfully recorded off the air by his fans, are available for free online on YouTube, on websites devoted to Shepard, and at the Internet Archive. Two hallmarks of his show were making fun of his radio station and brutally sabotaging the commercials. It used to be that radio stations had to identify themselves on the half hour as well as the hour. So Shep had to do the station ID 15 minutes into every program. And he would always contrive whatever he was saying to catch things at just the right moment. For example, speaking of brain damage, this is WOR 710 AM in New York. Or once I remember in the early 70s, he did a show almost entirely about radio station call letters and the slogans they stand for, just reading down the list together with his own sardonic commentary along the way. For example, KWKC, keep watching Kansas City. Or one I remember because of where I'm from, WTTM, World Takes, Trenton Makes. Oh, friends, I don't have to tell you what Trenton makes these days, do I, gang? And as he approached the bottom of the hour, there was this. Here's a strange one. We're old and raunchy. Oh, that reminds me, this is WOR in New York. As for the commercials, Shepard hated to have to stop talking in order to do them. Often he'd turn to the studio engineer and say, okay, Herb, hit the money button. But as they came on, that didn't necessarily stop Shepard, and he had a lot of fun with one of his major sponsors, Miller High Life Beer. And the perky little jingle would come on, Miller High Life, the bright, clean tasting beer, ba-ba-bum, and in would chime Shepard. Yes, friends, if you're planning to really tie one on this weekend, you do it right. You poke your snout into a trough of good old Miller High Life, sparkling, flavorful, and refreshing. And with his audience, his loyal following, it worked. He sold a lot of beer. He called his audience the night people. His show was on at night, and by that he conveyed, among other things, an implicit skepticism about consumer culture and its effects. Nights when you're relaxed, you have time to think just a receptive frame of mind for Shepard's unique insights. And the night people helped him pull off one of his most celebrated stunts. Shepard became annoyed when he learned how books made it to the bestseller lists of the New York Times and others. It was based mostly on requests for a book at bookshops and libraries. So he went on the air one night and said, "Okay, gang, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make up a book and make up an author for it. And then tomorrow and for the next couple of weeks, I want you to go into as many bookshops as you can and libraries and ask for the book." And over the course of the show, he came up with the title, I, Libertine. He said that he wanted something that might be able to get banned in Boston. He made up the name of an author, Frederick R. Ewing, and gave him the backstory of being a retired commander in the Royal Navy. So Shepard's night people fanned out over the WOR listening area, which was most of the East Coast, asking for the book. And according to Shep's recounting, within a few weeks, I, Libertine, began appearing on bestseller lists, made the list of books banned by the Legion of Decency in Boston, apparently made the list of books to be published in the New York Times Sunday section. At Rutgers, a professor recalled asking about it at a literary meeting, and somebody piped up that he had just finished it, though when questioned, he was a bit vague about the plot line. A gossip columnist wrote one day that he had just had lunch with Freddie Ewing, where they discussed his new book. Finally, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal broke the story of the hoax on the journal's front page. Apparently, there were a lot of red faces among movers and shakers not accustomed to being publicly embarrassed. Almost immediately, Ballantine Books contacted Shepard. They had been wanting to buy the paperback rights to I, Libertine. They signed up Shepard and the author Theodore Sturgeon to write a book of that title, which they did, of course, under the nom de plume, Frederick R. Ewing. And they turned out a mildly salacious 18th century romp in the spirit of Tom Jones. It's a collector's item now. Some of you may recognize the cover art as the work of the cartoonist Kelly Freas, who did covers for Mad Magazine for years. And there it is, turbulent, turgid, tempestuous. On the cover, its protagonist, aristocratic rake Lance Courtney. And on the back, the guy who started it all, Gene Shepard, in the role of Frederick R. Ewing. Every now and then there was one stunt Shepard would pull in the air. He called it hurling invective or hurling epithets. He'd say, "Okay, now here's what we're going to do. Turn the volume of your radio way down. Now go to the window and open it and put the radio on the sill with the speaker facing out. Now on my cue, turn up the volume all the way. Okay, do it now. Ready? Turn it up." And Shepard would bellow something completely ridiculous into the microphone like, "You don't think for a moment you're fooling anyone, do you?" Or, "Myrtle, this is the third time this week you've come home drunk. What about the kids?" And this would resound through the canyons of at least parts of New York and throughout suburban neighborhoods. Typical Shepard. Something to startle, though no more than a minor nuisance. A little subversive. Surprising the uninitiated. Bringing in each member of the audience as a co-conspirator, part of a clandestine group of those in the know. And through it, creating a one-on-one relationship with Shepard himself. And the inspiration for TV network newsman Howard Beale, played by Peter Finch in the 1977 movie Network, who told his viewers to go to the window, open it, and shout, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore." Paddy Chayefsky, who wrote the screenplay for Network, acknowledged Shep for that concept. He was a fan and friend of Gene Shepard. So was Shel Silverstein, one of Shepard's closest friends during his career in New York. Now, who recognizes the name Shel Silverstein? If you've ever read to your children the book Where the Sidewalk Ends, that's Shel Silverstein. He wrote songs, too. He was big and bent and gray and old, and I looked at him and my blood ran cold, and I said, "My name is Sue. How do you do?" Written by Shel Silverstein about the tribulations of a guy who goes through life with a girl's name, which he knew something about because for years he had a close friend named Jean, spelled Jean. As Shepard said in a broadcast years before the song came out, "You know how it felt growing up all your life with the name Jean, spelled with a J? Listen, I fist fought my way through every grade in school. How do you think I got so aggressive? Shepard was friends with the playwright Herb Gardner, whose title character in his play A Thousand Clowns, about an eccentric comedy writer, closely tracks Gene Shepard. It was later made into a movie with Jason Robards in the title role. Some nights on the radio were poetry nights. Shepard had a special fondness for the poems of Robert W. Service, and the Smithsonian chose him to read the collected works of Service for its Folkways records. He'd read pieces of Turn to the 20th Century Americana, George Ade's Fables in Verse, and pieces of folk poetry that appeared in local newspapers around the country, like The Hellbound Train, a stirring admonition against a life of sin, read with all of Shepard's sardonic wit. I've spoken earlier of Shepard's device of juxtaposing the momentous and the commonplace for humorous effect. For this, he often used a style we think of as mock heroic, describing in heroic language something quite pedestrian. You may remember in the Christmas Story movie, where it incorporates one of Shepard's short stories about the old man winning a prize in a contest. The lamp in the form of a woman's leg with a stiletto shoe and the shade made to look like a piece of lingerie. The old man beams with pride at his reward, but Mom hates the thing. And finally it meets its inevitable end, described by Shepard at his mock heroic best. On the fateful day, I came home from school and immediately opened the refrigerator door. Seconds later, I'm knocking together a salami sandwich. My old man, it was his day off, is in the shower, hollering as he always did. My mother's somewhere off in the front of the house, dusting. Life is one long song. The White Sox have won a ball game, and it's only spring training. The old man is singing. My brother's under the daybed, whimpering. The salami is as sweet as life itself. The first fireflies were beginning to flicker in the cottonwoods. Northern Indiana slowly was at long last emerging from the iron grip of the Midwestern winter. A softness in the air, a quickening of the pulse. Somewhere off in the distance, ball met bat. Robin called to Robin, and a screen door slammed. And then, crash! A split second of silence while the fuse sputtered and ignited. And it began. The old man knew. What broke? The bathroom door slammed open. He rushed out, carrying a bar of Lifebuoy, eyes rolling wildly. What happened? What broke? Oh, the lamp, came a soft, phony voice, feigning heartbreak. For the instant, the air vibrated with tension. A vast magnetic charge, a static blast of human electricity, made the air sing. My kid brother stopped in mid-whimper. I took the last bite of salami, knowing that this would be my last happy bite of salami forever. Gene Shepard's most productive years and all of his years broadcasting on radio fell into that interval between the collapse of network radio in America as it existed before television and the arrival of satellite syndication of radio and of National Public Radio. He was confined to one station, a big station in the biggest media market with a broad reach, and therefore with an outsized influence on other people with creative or literary propensities. Jerry Seinfeld, who grew up on Long Island listening to Gene Shepard, credits Shepard with the development of his own comic style, to the point that he actually named his second child Shepard Seinfeld, after Gene Shepard. But even that exposure in the biggest media market wasn't broad enough to bring him recognition nationally for his greatest work. He fell into that niche of artists who are described as having a cult following. Sitting here in front of you is a member of that cult. As I said at the outset, I won't be able to do justice to the work and career of Gene Shepard, and that's a good thing, not a bad one, because the real pleasure is exploring his work on your own. I have a bibliography and list of links, most importantly links to his radio shows with nearly all of the known extant Shepard broadcasts available free online. So there's a lot more to the man behind A Christmas Story than what meets the eye. And my wish for you is to have all of the fun and enjoyment with Gene Shepard that I've experienced as you discover more of his work for yourselves.